Good morning. Happy Wednesday. I'm going to try to keep this somewhat brief because there's a lot to cover, but my video on Officer Anderson and why Officer Anderson was fired has garnered a bunch of comments that I think should be addressed. They break down into two essential camps. Number one, so if Officer Anderson was ordered to commit a crime, should Officer Anderson do it? And that crime has been phrased in various ways. Mostly, if Officer Anderson was ordered to kill someone, murder someone, execute someone. The other basic argument is that Officer Anderson's analysis of the various laws is complete and correct, and that they are in fact unconstitutional. And Officer Anderson is warranted in instructing other officers to disobey those orders because Officer Anderson is 100% correct that those orders are unconstitutional. So I'm going to address both of those issues. And the first issue is the commit a crime. If you're ordered to commit a crime, the problem with being ordered to commit a crime is that you don't have to get into the constitutional analysis. It is a crime. It's a crime to commit murder. It's a crime to commit murder in every state and territory that I'm aware of. It's even a crime to commit murder if you're a military member. The UCMJ makes it a crime to commit murder. So that's not the right issue to approach it as. If you are ordered to commit a crime, it is probably a crime to order someone to commit a crime. And so at that point, the officer should arrest the superior, or at least verify that the superior is indeed requesting that the officer commit a crime before making the arrest. So I think that resolves that. There's also a huge issue between the two things: ordering someone to kill another person, ordering an officer to kill another person. Well, the person who's being killed is having his constitutional rights violated in addition to being the victim of a crime, but he also can't seek the court's redress for the grievance. He can't go to the court and say, hey, I was wrongfully executed, because he's dead. What we are seeing, though, with these stay-at-home orders is we're seeing fines, and we're seeing there might be arrests. I'm not sure. I've heard about arrests, but I haven't verified any. So maybe fines, maybe arrests. Either way, you're going to end up in front of a judge, and you're going to be able to tell the judge, hey, these are unconstitutional. And then the judge, pursuant to Marbury versus Madison, is going to get to decide whether or not those violations that you're accused of are constitutional or not. That's the way the system works. That's the way it's designed to work. The judicial department is designed to determine whether or not constitutional violations have occurred. That is not the prerogative of the police. The police commit constitutional violations regularly. There are suppression hearings all the time. There are bodies of works. If you go in and you look at the U.S. Constitution annotated, the Bill of Rights annotated, it's going to take up a huge amount of shelf space in a law library. And most of the entries in there, especially on the 4th, 5th, 6th, 8th Amendments, are cops fucking up people's constitutional rights. Cops make terrible decisions. I mean, not all cops, hashtag not all, hashtag not all the time, hashtag your mileage may vary, but cops are not the people to be determining whether or not constitutional rights are being violated. They don't have the education for it. They don't have the training for it. They're not surrounded. They don't have a law clerk to help them with their research. They're not sitting in a law library. They don't have years of experience as an attorney, first of all, before you can become a judge, generally speaking, at least in California. You don't have years of experience on the bench. You don't have a court of appeals that's looking out for you. You don't have two informed advocates, one against you, one for you, arguing it out, finding the case law, presenting it. It is not the purview of a police officer to determine what is or isn't constitutional. And so the remedy is, if you think that whatever law that you're under is unconstitutional, If you're subject to a stay-at-home order and you think it's unconstitutional, file a writ of habeas corpus. That'll get you in front of a judge. A judge will then decide whether or not that stay-at-home order is unconstitutional. If you've been issued a ticket, or if you've been arrested, if you've been issued a ticket, you have a day in court scheduled. If you've been arrested, you have a day in court scheduled. You'll get to go in front of a judge and you'll get to say this is unconstitutional. And then it doesn't matter what the officer thinks at that point. It's the judge's decision. So on the same subject, a lot of military members are telling me that the UCMJ requires that they don't follow unconstitutional orders. Well, I don't know who, if any of these people have been JAGs or otherwise in the actual legal portion of it. I'm not talking military police, because again, police officers aren't really qualified to make these determinations. But if you look at the Manual for Courts Martial, Article 90, I'm going to say, it says a couple things. First of all, it says that if you are insubordinate, you do so at your own peril. It's your own risk. You're taking your chances. Officer Anderson similarly is taking his chances by being insubordinate. And the second thing is the judge gets to make the determination. The judge is the determiner of what is or isn't a lawful order. So, I mean, think about that for a minute. It's not the military police who get to determine whether or not it's a lawful order. It's the judge. Another thing is, if you look at what people have been arrested for, tried and convicted for, it's not the constitutionality stuff. It's the constitutionality portion from the Manual for Courts Martial is your personal constitutional rights. If you're ordered, for example, not to marry a person of a different race, well, that's going to infringe upon your constitutional right to marry who you want to marry. And so that will probably not be a lawful order for you. But if you're ordered to kill someone, it goes into the same kind of analysis that it would in the civil realm. Would the average person of reasonable intelligence, the average reasonable person, would that average reasonable person know that is or should be considered a crime to kill somebody, to like not an enemy combatant, but like an enemy non-combatant, a civilian? Would the average person of reasonable intelligence know that that's a crime? That's what the court's going to look at. And people in Nazi Germany, they weren't put on trial for violating the Constitution. They were put on trial for committing war crimes. They did things that were illegal. They killed the Jews who were non-combatants. They killed prisoners of war. They started a war of aggression, I think was one of the charges, which, whatever you're going to do with that. But they weren't on trial for violating the Constitution. Violating the Constitution has nothing to do with Germany or Germans or anything like that. So I think we have dealt with the illegality aspect of it. Executing people is illegal. It's also a violation of the Due Process Clause, but it's illegal. And that's really where the analysis begins and ends. You can't commit crimes. And you don't even have to get into the constitutional analysis. The second portion that people seem to be trying to argue, but they just state it, they don't actually present anything to back it up, is that Officer Anderson knows what is unconstitutional, knows what isn't unconstitutional, is qualified to make that decision, etc. First thing I want to say is that Officer Anderson didn't identify with any level of specificity which orders, which actions are unconstitutional. He also didn't point to anything specific in the Constitution. There is no passage in the Constitution that says stay-at-home orders during pandemics are unconstitutional. He said the Constitution says, which is the same thing that I've heard quite a bit. The Supreme Court says. Oh, really? Where? Where does it say it? That's always a question that you should be asked if you want to be a critical thinker. Where does the Constitution say this thing? And what Anderson is going to have to do is Anderson is going to have to point to sections of it and interpret them and draw a conclusion based on his opinion as to what those sections mean and how they would apply to the facts, which is entirely the role of the judiciary. That's That's literally their role. And even Officer Anderson understands that, because Officer Anderson said, according to Marbury versus Madison, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. He said, according to the Supreme Court, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. The Supreme Court determined it. Officer Anderson tacitly understands that. So Officer Anderson can't throw out the rest of the Marbury versus Madison, where it says that the Supreme Court gets to determine what is or isn't constitutional, or the judiciary gets to determine what is or isn't constitutional, not Officer Anderson. But yet he wants to only take part of it. He's cherry picking the portion of Marbury versus Madison. He wants you guys, if you're believing him, if you're supporting him, you're doing the same thing. It's part and parcel. The Supreme Court gets to determine it. But despite Officer Anderson not being able to point to any specific law, because you got to remember there's like 50-ish states in the Union. There's 50 states in the Union, but like 40, I think, ish of them have enacted some level of stay-at-home order or some level of pandemic control. I think it's roughly around there. I mean, I don't know if it's 38. I don't know if it's 45. But not all 50 states have done it. I don't know what the territories have done, like Guam or Puerto Rico. I don't know specifically what District of Columbia has done, but I know that some states have and some states have not. Most states have. So there's a lot of orders out there. And I know for like California, the governor isn't issuing any orders. He's issuing advisories. And then the counties are issuing the orders. So you've got a patchwork of all the counties in California making these orders and enforcing these orders. Which ones of those are unconstitutional? Which ones aren't? He isn't saying. And he's not saying because he doesn't know. And he's just kind of relying on these other officers to know. I don't think that's a very reasonable position. But it's not always easy to know when the Constitution is being violated. And I want to bring you back to Marbury versus Madison. In Marbury versus Madison, you have some names that you should be very familiar with. You have Adams, who was the outgoing president, who tried to get Marbury appointed. You had Jefferson, who was the incoming president, who didn't want Marbury appointed. You had Madison, who was the Secretary of State for Jefferson. You had Marshall, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. All of these men were founding fathers. All of these men had a hand in the crafting, the debating the Constitution. I strongly suspect that they didn't make the Constitution very tightly worded because they had to get all 13 colonies on board, but they all had a hand in the crafting of it. The issue in Marbury versus Madison, there was two of them. One is, did Madison have to issue the commission to Marbury? Issue number two is Congress had made a law giving the Supreme Court original jurisdiction over that type of writ. The question before the Supreme Court is, did Congress have the authority to enlarge the original jurisdiction for the Supreme Court? Now you have to remember that this is, about a decade after the Constitution was ratified, so there are still a lot of founding fathers in Congress, active in politics. And what the Supreme Court found, what Marshall found, is that Congress passed a law that was not constitutional. That law was not constitutional. The Supreme Court didn't have the power to issue that writ because it was not in the Constitution. So you had a whole bunch of people, founding fathers, who didn't know what the F was going on with the Constitution because it's a very vaguely worded document. Take your average apartment lease. Take your average contract to buy a house. Take your average contract to buy a car. You'll probably find more words in any single one of them than you will find in the entire Constitution. And you have to remember that the Bill of Rights is a very small portion of the Constitution. Each one of the first 10 amendments is 1 to 4 sentences long, roughly. I mean, there is a lot of gray area in there. And so we have to rely on the courts to decipher them. And I think most people, I know I got a lot of people who say, I don't trust the courts. Well, you don't trust the courts because the courts don't always agree with you, but you're not the end all be all. You're not the smartest person in the world, and I'm not the smartest person in the world. And the courts aren't always right, but the courts do a pretty damn fine job because we are still doing pretty well as a nation. We still have a lot of freedoms. But some of these things, if you look at the actual text of the amendment, doesn't make any sense. And it certainly wouldn't work well in today's society. Because if you look at the First Amendment, it says Congress shall make no law abridging freedoms of speech, press, religion, all that other fun stuff. Congress shall make no law. Well, you know what? Governors aren't Congress. Mayors aren't Congress. Presidential executive orders, Congress didn't make those. One could theoretically argue that Congress gave regulatory commissions the right to promulgate regulations. But you could also make the argument that, like, the FCC is not Congress. So should the First Amendment apply to anything that's not Congress? Should it apply to those other portions of government? I think we all agree it should. So you can't just look at the words. You have to look at what the Supreme Court has done. So in this particular situation that we are in, we can't say with any degree of accuracy whether or not any specific order that has been issued is or is not constitutional. And I'm going to go back again to Bill de Blasio. He made the order outlawing protests in New York City. There is a test that a court is going to have to go through. They're going to have to look at various factors of it. The court's going to have to run through the test. That's a job for the court to do. That's not a job for the police to do. Their job is to enforce the order. If they arrest a protester, then that protester can go to the court and say, hey, I was arrested for this. It's unconstitutional. Or even before that, a protester could seek declaratory and injunctive relief saying, hey, there is this order. I think this order is unconstitutional. It is chilling my free speech. I want to challenge it. And then the court will look at it and the court will make a determination. Right now, all across the country, we are seeing these lawsuits pop up. None have been overly successful thus far. Most get kicked out in the very beginning. 12b6 failure to state a claim kind of issue. Demur. So at this point, we don't know what, if any, of these orders are constitutional or not. Now, you can have your opinion, and your opinion is just as valid as my opinion. It's just as valid as Officer Anderson's opinion, and it's just as valid as the people who are issuing these orders' opinion. It's all just opinions. Everybody's got one, just like an asshole. But they're just opinions. And until the courts have looked at these things, we don't know. And to have the police officers backseat and say what orders they're going to follow and what orders they're not, that leads to tyranny. That is an unbalancing of the separation of powers. If you believe in the Constitution, you will believe in separation of powers. And the executive branch should not usurp the authority of the judicial branch. And that's what you're advocating for. And you've got to remember, cops make bad decisions all the time. That's why there are suppression hearings. That's why there's a fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine. That's why there's mountains of case law on officers overstepping bounds, constitutional bounds. Don't put officers in that position. Don't advocate for officers being in that position, or else you will get the tyranny that you're desiring. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.